We are here at the Herndon Community Television Studio with filmmaker and artist Rebekah Wingert-Jabi. Rebekah, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to come down to our studio just to share and talk about the filmmaking process.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So now, Rebekah, we understand that you're actually a local to the Northern Virginia area. You actually spent a good part of your childhood in this area.
Absolutely, yes. I moved to Reston when I was 3 days old and grew up in Reston and had an amazing childhood in Reston and actually moved back to Reston, of course, went off to school and lived in different places around the world, in the Middle East and China, but came back to Reston about 8 years ago to raise my daughter here. It's a very special place. It means a lot to me.
And we understand that you studied over at the University of California?
I did. So for my graduate studies, I was at the University of Southern California, where I studied film and television, and lived in Los Angeles, and while I was there, had an incredible learning experience at USC, which I value tremendously, but I really missed Northern Virginia. In Los Angeles, there's an incredible vibrancy among the filmmaking community. It was very inspiring in so many ways, and but I miss trees and I miss the seasons changing. So coming back home was something I really wanted to do, and was glad when I finally did it.
So what inspired you to begin taking the route of learning the process of film?
Right. Well, I started in the visual medium in high school, at Oakton High School, actually. I lived in Oakton during my high school years, and I took still photography classes there and had a phenomenal teacher who really made that process very engaging for me. And I struggled with learning disabilities growing up and had a really hard time expressing myself in the written medium. And so I found that finally I had a space in which I felt like I could really express myself and get my thoughts out to the world. And then when I went to college, I spent a year in China, and as I left for my trip, my parents gave me a very small high-8 camera, and just to document my experience there. And as I started to see the impact of the moving image and how that works with sound, I just became really engaged in that medium, and then actually made my first film in China. It's a terrible film. It's it was, but it taught me that that I could do better, and that I really liked working in that medium. And what particularly struck me there with that experience is that the film was about the life history of a man who lived through the Communist Revolution, who lived through the Japanese invasion, and he had amazing stories to tell. And I became very aware that this is a medium that can get stories, untold stories, out into the world. And that was something I was very interested in doing. I felt was very powerful.
And of course, with film, visual medium, that way a person can share a variety of type of stories, but you have an interest in documentary vision. So what is it about the documentaries? How has a person said about that process?
Wow. So there's so many different ways of making a documentary. I mean, particularly now that, you can make movies on your cell phone. I think the approach to documentary filmmaking is expanding greatly. But at the same time, there's some fundamentals to the filmmaking process that I think are really fundamental to storytelling. And that crosses fiction film, it crosses documentary, it crosses any kind of written storytelling. And that it's really there's so many ways to tell a story, but there are some fundamentals that really work that you could use as a storyteller. And one of those fundamentals is a strong character that your audience can identify with in some way. Feel like they're accessible enough that they can get into their shoes for the 20, 30, 60 minutes of film time. And I think that's very core to the documentary process, as core as it is to a fiction film. I mean, when we think about some of the most known fiction films, I think you can immediately identify a character with the film. So if you think of Star Wars, you might think of Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader. You know, these are parts of the filmmaking experience that on some kind of human psychological level really work with audiences when you can connect to a lead character. So in documentary, as in with a fiction film, you're constantly seeking out a character that has a strong story to tell, that is accessible enough to your audience that they feel like they can sit with them and identify with them on some level for 20 to 30 minutes or 60 minutes, however long your film is. So that's one of the number one factors that you're looking for when, at least for me, when I'm beginning to make a documentary. Do I have a character, and does that character have a story to tell? And then, of course, you're looking from a storytelling perspective. You're looking too to see, you know, does my story have some form of a beginning, middle, and end? You know, there's a traditional notion of a 3-act structure, and you can apply that to in storytelling, and you can apply that to documentary, you can apply that to fiction film, you can apply that to writing. So you're looking for not only a character that your audience can identify with, but also someone that has some type of beginning, middle, and end to whatever story you're trying to tell in this film. And then, you know, too, there's that constant element in storytelling of conflict. That somehow, again, on a psychological level, really works with audiences. If you have some form of conflict and you see that character trying to resolve that conflict, going through a process in doing that, and then ultimately either failing or succeeding in that, again, that's a traditional mechanism, storytelling mechanism, that works in documentary just as it works in other mediums.
Yes, and so Rebekah, some of your works, again, have also been done on a global scale. Some you traveled, including one that you went over off towards the Middle East to shoot a project that resolved, again, around an interesting conflict about essentially the area of Palestine. And so tell us again about that project, which got, again, global recognition.
Sure, that film is called My Neighborhood, and I produced, co-directed that film with Julia Basha, an incredible filmmaker who is with an organization called Just Vision, and they do a lot of, they not only make documentary films, but they do a lot of outreach with their films in Israel, in the West Bank, and in the United States, and around the world. So I was fortunate, very fortunate to work with them on this film, My Neighborhood. I started filming on this film in 2008, and I was living in the West Bank at the time. I lived there for 8 years, on and off for 8 years. And I started filming in this particular neighborhood where the film takes place. It's called Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. And I started filming there because a producer actually from Los Angeles came to me, and he's also someone who's very interested in, really an activist for peace, who said, you know, I'm hearing a lot about the settlement development in Jerusalem. There's a lot happening there, but it's not really getting a lot of media coverage. So can we take a look and see if there's a story to be told there? And so I looked around at different neighborhoods in Jerusalem, all of which are facing, in East Jerusalem I should say specifically, all of which are facing real challenges. One of the key challenges is settlement growth and development. And I went to this neighborhood, Sheikh Jarrah, and met, on the day that I was there, I met a family who the next day was going to be in court to hear the decision on whether they would be evicted from their homes. It's a Palestinian family, and if they were, then a settler family would move into their homes on the day of the eviction. And that community was, this is the first eviction that was potentially going to take place there, and the community was incredible. They organized themselves. They had a media relations committee, which I was interacting with, and had gotten international attention actually to their issue. International delegates were coming to visit their community. So they really inspired me to look into what was happening there, and it was an opportunity for me as a filmmaker to essentially have a beginning, middle, and end to a story, to see how this process, which was just beginning to unfold at that moment when I was there, how that would actually take place, and how the people who were experiencing it would respond. And what amazed me and the Just Vision team as we were documenting this story in this neighborhood was that as we were documenting the story, something quite remarkable happened. Not only were we introduced to Muhammad El-Kurd, who's a resident of that community, whose family was under threat of eviction, who was 11 years old at the time, an incredible young man who is an amazing writer, and who we began to talk to and document as his community was going through this experience, and got to see it through his eyes. But also, there emerged a Jewish organizational effort to bring a Jewish-Israeli organizational effort to bring attention to what was happening in the neighborhood. And that was pretty remarkable, because in East Jerusalem you have essentially an invisible barrier between West Jerusalem, which is predominantly Jewish-Israeli, and East Jerusalem, which is predominantly Palestinian. And very few people cross that invisible line. But here we had a group of Jewish Israelis coming together saying, hey, we are going to cross that line. We do want to know what's happening in this neighborhood, and we want other Israelis to know about it.
Yes, and so again, in this process, you got to meet a number of different persons who lived in this area, so it was an opportunity to connect with a variety of different personalities, and again, some which were covered in this documentary. Was it a very long time investment in getting this production together?
It was. So I started filming in 2008, and it was released in 2012. So yes, and that's one of the challenges with documentary. They take time. When you want to let your audience feel the beginning and middle and end of an experience, you have to be there documenting the beginning, middle, and an end. And when you start on a project, when you're documenting real life, you have really, generally, most of the time, you don't know when it's going to end, right? I mean, and sometimes it really doesn't end. You know, does a situation like what's happening in Shakespeare ever really complete itself in some nice package? Typically it doesn't. So you as a filmmaker are challenged to find some kind of end for your audience so that they can, you can complete your film, and also they can have this journey of a beginning, middle, and end in the film viewing experience. So it takes time. It takes time to get to know the situation. It takes time to get to know characters, to find the right character, the one who can engage your audience on a deep level and who has that story to tell, and to document a process. And then once you get all of your footage in the editing room, to figure out really what your story is. You know, I think many documentary filmmakers find that their story comes to them in the editing process. And that takes a lot of time. Imagine having somewhere around 200 hours of footage to go through. And in addition to footage that we collected, we also had footage that activists were taking on their cell phones, on small cameras, as things were unfolding in the neighborhood. So not only did we have our footage, we had their footage to go through. So processing that and figuring out what your key moments are in the film and building those key moments takes a lot of time, much more time than I think most people imagine. And then you have to get it out to the world. You know, that's a whole nother process too. Submitting it to film festivals, going to the festivals, hoping that you get a broadcast.
So it really is a process.
It's a very extensive process, yes.
And so, for example, again, another still that we had, documentary, this individual, again, he was another character who contributed to the film. His name was
Zvi Beninga.
Okay.
He's one of the key characters in the film. He's a Jewish Israeli who lives in Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. And he's from a family, his mother is American Israeli, and his father grew up in America. He also grew up in Europe as well. But he came from a family that really wasn't an activist family. And he and his sister, Sarah Beninga, started to go to Sheikh Jarrah because they heard what was happening there. It's not too far from their home. It's a short drive. And they, along with other Jewish Israelis, were there in Sheikh Jarrah trying to understand what was happening and trying to bring attention to the issue. And because of their activism, they actually got their parents involved. So the film shows how their mother is actually involved in the protests, and we documented the first time their father went down to the protest. There's weekly protest at Sheikh Jarrah at that time, and he joined that for the first time. We were there to document it, and he had a very powerful reflection in that moment that his own family was one of Holocaust survivors, and that being there in this experience reminded him of how important it is that to have righteous people who are willing to put themselves, who are brave enough to put themselves into potentially harm's way for justice, for the sake of justice.
So going back to the lines of distribution, I mean, with some of these films, they were actually able to convey the story quite well, and they got the recognition, even so far as getting a Peabody Award for again that particular one regarding your film that was done over in Palestine, that area. And you didn't stop there. You actually continued and more recently did a production that is really, again, about your neighborhood over here at Reston.
That's right.
And so, again, this one was actually, I guess, covered. Was it its purpose just to cover, again, the history of Reston, or what was your aims in that one?
So the film that's just now getting out into festivals about Reston, it's called Another Way of Living, the Story of Reston, Virginia. And actually we have a screening on March 24th at the National Building Museum as part of the Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital, which is very exciting for us. That film emerged out of kind of two things coming together really nicely. When I moved back to Reston about 8 years ago, I felt like it was time to finally make the film about Reston I had really wanted to make. Growing up in Reston, I had an incredible childhood. There were things I experienced here which really enriched my life in a very profound way. And I didn't realize how much it enriched my life until I left Reston and went to other suburban areas in our area. When I was a teenager, my family moved to a nearby suburb where we had a single-family home, a fence, about an acre of land, and I felt, this is the American dream, we finally got it. And actually, it was really disappointing for me. I felt very isolated there. I felt isolated from the people around me, from my neighbors. I only knew one or two of my neighbors. I felt isolated from nature. It wasn't like Reston where I could step out of my door and find myself walking on a path and being surrounded by natural environment. And I started to think at that point, why is Reston different? Is Reston really that different than a lot of other places? And then as I went around the world, I lived in Los Angeles, I lived in Jerusalem, I lived in Beijing, I felt, wow, there's something really different about that experience. And I'd heard of course, names like James Rosant, Bill Conklin growing up. These are people who were right there with Bob Simon as they were putting the plan in place for Reston, creating the master plan. And of course, I knew Bob Simon. I mean, growing up, he was essentially like a father figure to me, and I think many Restonians. And when I came back, I knew that he was in his 90s, and that we were coming up on Reston's 50th anniversary. And I felt like that was a really important time to document what Reston was over those 50 years, but also to look ahead with Metro coming, with redevelopment, and say, hey, you know, this community was founded on such remarkable principles. And those principles guided this community over 50 years. Where are they today? And are they going to continue to guide us over the next 50 years?
Yes, and again, Robert E. Simon, the man who helped develop the entire community of Reston. So many people within the Reston area who remember just seeing him walk along near Lake Anne, where he resided.
That's right.
So he had an interesting story in the development of Reston.
Incredible.
And so what was his approach, to seeing your team gather footage and material? And what was his reaction?
He was very patient with us because we were at his doorstep a lot. Oh gosh, we had several interviews with him. We even dragged him up to New York to film him around Carnegie Hall, because he was the president of Carnegie Hall for many years, and actually used the proceeds from the sale of Carnegie Hall to buy the land that became Reston. So, boy, and his wife, Cheryl Terrio Simon, he and her were both just so patient with us. And I think, though, that they both appreciated that it was important to document his point of view on this story, and so we were fortunate that he was willing to give us his time. This is actually a shot of us filming his famous walk around Lake Anne, which is actually one of my favorite pieces in the film and one of my favorite moments with him. I felt like I was most with him when I was on that walk with him, because he loves life so much. He loves the outdoors. I mean, as we were on this walk with him, we were just stopping constantly. Oh, look at the buds. Just a few weeks ago, these buds were this way, and now they're this way. Look at the birds, and look what he was so observant, enjoyed it so much, and then, of course, just loved it when someone would pass him and he could start up a conversation. He's this uber extrovert, and he loves communicating with people. So that's when I felt like I was really with Bob, and that was a very precious experience.
Yes, Robert E. Simon, he was very, very interesting, very genuine character. And so, I mean, so many people, when he passed, so many people were just surprised because they essentially expected him to just always be there.
That's right. That captures that feeling very well. I think even though he was 101, we were still all surprised. He had so much love for life. I don't think I've ever been with somebody who embraced life so deeply as he did. It was just hard to imagine him not being there on those walks anymore, or saying hello. And he, I think, was very much a part of the lives of every Restonian on some level, whether it's as the father figure, whether it's as the person who calls you up and is saying, you have to get on this issue. He was always very deeply involved in whatever was happening and had a very strong opinion about it, and would constantly get people involved in doing something about what he thought should be done. Or, he's the person you just walk on the path and say hello to, but knowing that he's there, his presence is there, knowing that he's always looking out for what he thinks is the best interest of Reston and Restonians, there was something so special and precious about that, that I feel very, I miss a lot.
Bob Simon transformed what we think of when we think of a suburb. This is a major contribution to the nature of life in America.
for a long time, the suburbs were seen as exclusively rows and rows of the same kind of cookie-cutter houses. Yet, we couldn't get out of that box.
There was a price to be paid for it. A sense of alienation, disconnection. Bob Simon said, I bet we can do it a better way.
At one extreme, you have the hermit. He gets his kicks out of solitude. I'm anti-hermit. I get my kicks out of people.
The major single thought was wanting to make it possible to have a real community. People of all incomes, races, living happily together.
What Simon got is that when you were building a suburb, you weren't building a bedroom, you were building a community. And that was a thing that had been missing in suburban development.
The houses were not selling as fast as they had hoped.
Gulf had reached a point that in order to put in any more money, they insisted on taking over management of the project.
Had two major oil companies not stepped in with hundreds of millions of dollars, Reston would not be there today.
With Bob no longer in charge, the citizens wanted to make sure that the vision continued the way he had conceived it.
In the next few minutes, you'll be meeting Reston's founder, Robert Simon.
There were many, many people who wanted to continue having a relationship with him.
He was trying to decide whether or not to move to Reston. I said, come back, come back. With the metro coming here, it's going to make big changes. We need to keep reminding people about what Reston is.
His heart is still so deep in this town. And he cares so much about how things turn out.
And that just reflects again on the capabilities of what a good professional filmmaker can do. They can actually capture that story and then convey it to hundreds, if not millions of people. So, yes. So just in brief review, if a person was to ever enter into that study of being maybe a documentary filmmaker, what's just some of the quick side notes or advice that you would give to anyone who was interested in that?
I'd say typically it's a hard process. It can be a long, hard process. I mean, obviously you can approach it so many different ways. You can make it easier or harder. But generally I think people underestimate how much goes into making a film. So I would take that into consideration. And I would also say that I think everyone has a story to tell, and that your characters or your story doesn't have to be on a global scale. Your story can be your father's story, can be your community story, it can be your neighborhood story. And I think those stories, whatever you feel connected to as a filmmaker, whatever you feel passionate about, I think that's the kind of material that's going to produce the strongest story for you.
All right, Rebekah, we want to thank you so much for coming over, just to share about the documentary and film process and about just how a person can really navigate through that field. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. I appreciate it.